The blood-red sunset painted the sky as Hank Dawson stared at the rolling hills of his ranch, a whiskey bottle clutched in his calloused hand. The 5-year anniversary of Catherine's death had come again, and with it, the familiar ache that never quite left his chest. In 1878, Douglas, Wyoming Territory wasn't kind to broken men, but the land didn't care about a man's grief. It demanded work regardless. He took another swig, feeling the burn down his throat. Catherine had died in childbirth, along with their son, leaving Hank with nothing but 20 acres of stubborn land and a promise he'd made to himself, never to love again. Love was a thief that took everything and left you hollow. The wind picked up, sending a chill through his bones despite the warm June evening. Behind him, his modest ranch house stood silent, and beyond that, the large barn where he kept his horses and stored hay for the harsh Wyoming winters. His nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, which suited him fine. Solitude was a comfort he'd grown accustomed to. Hank drained the last of the whiskey and tossed the empty bottle aside. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and he had work to come with the dawn. He pushed himself up from the porch step, his knees protesting after a long day of mending fences. A sound caught his attention, faint but unmistakable. A baby's cry. Hank froze, wondering if the whiskey was playing tricks on his mind. But then he heard it again, clearer this time, coming from the direction of his barn. He grabbed his Winchester rifle from inside the door frame and moved cautiously across the yard. The barn door was ajar, though he was certain he'd closed it before heading to the house. The crying grew louder as he approached. With his rifle ready, Hank pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The lantern he'd left hanging still burned low, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. He moved deeper into the barn, following the sound until he reached the far stall where he kept fresh hay. What he saw made him lower his rifle immediately. A young woman lay curled on her side in the hay, her dress dirty and torn, her dark hair tangled around her pale face. Cradled in her arms was a tiny infant, red-faced and squalling. The woman appeared to be sleeping or unconscious, but her arms remained protectively wrapped around the child. "Madam," Hank called, keeping his distance. She didn't stir. The baby continued to cry, small fists waving in the air. Hank set his rifle aside and knelt beside her. Her skin was hot to the touch fever. The baby couldn't have been more than a few days old, still wrinkled and new to the world. "Madam, can you hear me?" he tried again, gently shaking her shoulder. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes the color of a summer storm. For a moment they focused on him, wide with fear. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked and dry. "Don't turn us away." Then her eyes closed again, and her head lolled to the side. Hank felt panic rise in his throat. He had no idea what to do with an unconscious woman and a newborn, but he couldn't leave them in his barn. With careful movements, he gathered the baby first, awkwardly cradling the tiny form against his chest. The child quieted somewhat, still whimpering. "I'll be right back for you, madam," he said, though he doubted she could hear him. He carried the infant to the house, placed it on his bed surrounded by pillows to prevent it from rolling, then hurried back to the barn. The woman was light in his arms as he lifted her, concerning him even more. He carried her to the house and placed her on the bed beside her child. In the better light of his cabin, he could see how young she was, perhaps early 20s, and how exhausted she appeared. Her clothes were travel-worn, and a small cloth satchel was slung across her body. The baby had started crying again, its tiny face scrunched in distress. Hank ran a hand through his hair, at a complete loss. The nearest doctor was in town, a good hour's ride, and he couldn't leave them alone. He remembered some of what his mother had taught him about fevers and fetched a basin of cool water and a cloth. As he placed the damp cloth on the woman's forehead, he noticed a gold ring on her finger. Married then, but where was her husband? He awkwardly picked up the crying infant again, holding it against his shoulder as his mother had once shown him with his younger siblings. "Hush now," he murmured, patting its back gently. "Your mama's going to be all right." The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. He had no idea if the woman would survive the night, and then what would become of the child. The baby continued to cry, and Hank realized with a start that it was probably hungry. He had no milk, no way to feed an infant. Panic threatened to overwhelm him again, but he forced it down. One problem at a time, he placed the baby back on the bed and hurried to dampen another cloth. Remembering something his mother had done for his teething sister long ago, he dipped the corner of the cloth in water and placed it against the infant's lips. The baby instinctively began to suckle, though Hank knew it would provide little nourishment. "I need to get help," he said aloud, though there was no one conscious to hear him, "but I can't leave you alone." The woman stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering again. Hank leaned closer. "Madam, can you hear me? I need to know what to do for your baby." Her lips moved, barely a whisper escaping. "Water with sugar, just until." Her voice trailed off, but Hank understood. He quickly mixed sugar with warm water in a small cup, then used the cloth to let the baby suckle the sweet liquid. It wasn't ideal, but it might keep the infant satisfied until he could figure out what to do next. Through the night, Hank alternated between tending to the woman's fever and giving the baby sugar water. By dawn, he was exhausted but relieved to see the woman's fever had broken. She slept more peacefully now, her breathing even. As the first light of morning filtered through the cabin windows, Hank saddled his horse. He would ride to the widow Hanson's place. First she had a milk cow and might know what to do for the infant, then he would fetch the doctor from town. He checked on the woman and child once more before leaving. The baby had finally fallen asleep, tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. "I'll be back soon," he promised, though neither stirred at his words. The widow Hanson's homestead was a welcome sight after the tense night. Her chimney was already smoking, telling him she was awake despite the early hour. Hank dismounted and knocked on her door, explaining the situation as briefly as possible. Martha Hanson was a practical woman who had raised 6 children of her own before losing her husband to a mining accident. She didn't ask unnecessary questions, simply gathered what she needed and followed Hank back to his ranch on her own horse. When they arrived, the woman was awake, propped up against Hank's pillows with the baby in her arms. Her eyes widened with fear when they entered. "It's all right," Hank said quickly. "This is Mrs. Hanson. She's here to help." "The baby needs proper feeding," Mrs. Hanson said, approaching the bed. "I've brought milk from my cow and we can dilute it slightly for the little one. What's your name, dear?" The young woman hesitated, her arms tightening around her child. "Lily," she finally said. "Lily Ross, and this is Emma." "Well, Lily, you look like you've had a rough time of it. How old is your daughter?" 3 days, Lily replied, her voice still weak. I had her on the road." Hank felt a chill at her words. Alone on the road with a newborn child, what desperate circumstances had driven her to such a state? "Mr. Dawson here says you had a fever," Mrs. Hanson continued, already preparing the cow's milk for the baby. "Are you feeling any better this morning?" "Yes, thank you." Lily's eyes moved to Hank, filled with uncertainty and gratitude. "I don't know how to repay your kindness, sir." "No need," he said gruffly, uncomfortable with her thanks. "Anyone would have done the same, Mrs. Hanson gave him a knowing look that said plainly not everyone would have, in fact, been so charitable to a strange woman and her baby. "I'll ride for the doctor now," Hank said, eager to escape the suddenly crowded feeling of his small cabin. "There's no need," Lily protested. "I'm feeling much better, truly." "The doctor should check both you and the baby," Mrs. Hanson insisted, taking Emma from Lily's arms to feed her the diluted milk. "Childbirth is dangerous enough with help nearby. What you've done is nothing short of miraculous, but you need proper care." Hank nodded in agreement and left before Lily could argue further. The ride to Douglas gave him time to think, to consider the strange turn his solitary life had taken overnight. He'd gone from mourning Catherine's death anniversary to harboring a young mother and her newborn. The irony wasn't lost on him. 5 years to the day since he'd lost his wife and son in childbirth, and now this. It felt like some cosmic joke at his expense. Dr. Wilson was fortunately in his office when Hank arrived in town. The doctor listened to Hank's explanation without interruption, then gathered his medical bag. "She's lucky she made it to your barn," the doctor commented as they rode back to the ranch. Childbed fever kills more women than anything else, especially without proper care. She said she gave birth on the road, Hank replied. Alone, the doctor shook his head grimly. Then she's either incredibly fortunate or incredibly strong, possibly both. When they returned, Mrs. Hanson had things well in hand. Lily had been helped to wash, her hair combed and braided, and she wore one of Hank's clean shirts over her dress. The baby had been bathed and wrapped in a clean piece of flannel that Mrs. Hanson had brought, Dr. Wilson examined both mother and child thoroughly, pronouncing them remarkably well considering the circumstances. The fever appears to have broken completely, he told Hank privately. But she's weak from the birth and from what looks like several days of insufficient food and rest. She needs time to recover before traveling again if that's her intention. Hank nodded, uncertain of what to do with this information. He couldn't very well turn a recovering mother and newborn out, but his home wasn't set up for guests, especially not female ones with infants, Mrs. Hanson solved his immediate dilemma by announcing she would stay a few days to help Lily and teach her how to care for the baby. Just until she's on her feet properly, she assured Hank, as if sensing his discomfort. That evening, after the doctor had gone and Mrs. Hanson had retired to the small room Hank had hastily cleared for her, he found himself alone with Lily for the first time since she'd awakened. She sat in his rocking chair, the baby asleep in her arms, her eyes on the flames in the fireplace. "Thank you," she said softly as he entered. "I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't found your barn." Hank nodded awkwardly, taking a seat at his small table. "Where were you heading?" he asked, the question that had been bothering him all day. Lily's eyes remained on the fire. "Anywhere," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Just away. Away from what?" When she didn't immediately answer, he added, "Or who?" She looked up then, her gray eyes filled with a fear that made his chest tighten. "My husband," she whispered. The wedding ring on her finger suddenly seemed less a symbol of commitment and more like a shackle. Hank felt an unexpected surge of anger toward a man he'd never met. "He hurt you." The question was unnecessary. The answer was written in the way she held herself, in the shadow that crossed her face at the mention of her husband. "Yes," she admitted, "and I feared what he might do to Emma." Hank's hands clenched into fists. He had never understood men who raised their hands to women or children. His father had taught him that a man's strength was meant to protect, not harm. "Where is he now?" he asked, already calculating whether he needed to set a watch tonight. "Back in Cheyenne, I hope." "I left while he was away on business." She stroked Emma's tiny head, her expression softening as she looked at her daughter. "When I discovered I was with child, I knew I had to leave. James, he never wanted children, said they were noisy, expensive burdens." The contempt in her voice when she spoke her husband's name told Hank all he needed to know about the man. "You're safe here," he found himself promising. "You can stay until you're well enough to travel, and I'll help you get wherever you're going next." Gratitude and relief flooded her face. "I don't know where that is yet," she admitted. "I had some money saved, but most of it went for the stagecoach ticket. I got as far as the crossroads about 5 miles back, but then my pains started and I had to." She trailed off, and Hank could only imagine the terror of giving birth alone, miles from help. "Well, you don't need to figure it out tonight," he said gruffly. "Get some rest, we'll talk more tomorrow." As he rose to leave her to the bedroom, he would sleep on a bedroll by the fire. She called his name. "Mr. Dawson," he turned back. "Why did you help us? You could have sent us away or left us in the barn." The question caught him off guard. Why had he helped? 5 years ago, he had sworn never to let another person close enough to hurt him when they inevitably left. Yet something about the sight of Lily and her baby had bypassed all his defenses. "Anyone would have," he repeated his earlier answer, unable to articulate the more complex truth. Lily's gaze was steady, seeing more than he wanted to reveal. "No," she said softly, "not everyone would have." He nodded once, uncomfortable with her perception, and left her to rest. That night, lying on his bedroll before the dying fire, Hank listened to the unfamiliar sounds of other people in his home. The occasional creak of the rocking chair as Lily nursed her baby, Mrs. Hanson's soft snores from the small back room, the tiny mewling noises Emma made in her sleep. For 5 years he had lived with nothing but silence and memories. Now his cabin was filled with life, complicated, messy, demanding life. He should have resented the intrusion. Instead, he found himself listening for those sounds when they quieted, making sure all was well. As dawn approached, Hank rose and dressed quietly, determined to complete his morning chores before the others woke. He stepped outside to find the world washed clean by an overnight rain, the air fresh and cool. His horses nickered in greeting as he entered the barn to feed and water them. The empty stall where he'd found Lily and Emma gave him pause. Had it only been one night ago, it felt as if they had been part of his life for far longer. He pushed the thought away and focused on his work. By the time he returned to the house, Mrs. Hanson had breakfast cooking, and Lily sat at the table with Emma cradled in one arm. "Good morning, Mr. Dawson," Mrs. Hanson greeted him cheerfully. "I hope you don't mind that I've taken liberties with your kitchen." "Not at all," he replied, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. The smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee made his stomach rumble appreciatively. Lily looked better this morning. Some color returned to her cheeks. She had found time to mend the torn places in her dress, he noticed, and had tied back her dark hair with a ribbon Mrs. Hanson must have provided. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Hanson said as she placed plates on the table. "Lily needs proper things for the baby. Diapers, gowns, blankets. I've some things I saved from my grandchildren's visits, but she'll need more if she's staying a while." The implication hung in the air. How long would Lily be staying? Hank hadn't thought beyond a few days of recovery. "I don't wish to impose," Lily said quickly. "Once I'm strong enough, I'll move on." "And go where?" Mrs. Hanson asked directly. "With what money and with a newborn besides?" Lily had no answer for that, her eyes dropping to her plate. "There's work to be had in Douglas," Mrs. Hanson continued, "but not for a woman with a days-old infant. You need time to recover your strength, and the baby needs stability." Hank saw where this was heading and felt a moment of panic. Was Mrs. Hanson suggesting that Lily stay with him indefinitely? The idea was preposterous. He was a bachelor, she a married woman regardless of her separation from her husband. People would talk. "Mrs. Hanson," he began, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "I'm not suggesting anything improper, Mr. Dawson, merely pointing out practical realities. Lily needs a safe place and you have room. I can stay as chaperone for propriety's sake until other arrangements can be made." Hank looked at Lily, who appeared as uncomfortable as he felt. "What do you want, Mrs. Ross?" he asked directly. She met his eyes, her own showing conflict. "I want safety for my daughter," she said finally, "and time to make a plan, but I won't stay where I'm not welcome, and I insist on earning my keep." The determination in her voice impressed him. Despite everything she'd been through, she maintained her dignity and self-respect. "You're welcome to stay while you recover," he found himself saying, "and we'll figure out the rest later. As for earning your keep, we can discuss that when you're stronger." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you," Mrs. Hanson looked satisfied. "Then it's settled. Now, after breakfast, I'll make a list of what's needed from town. You can fetch it when you have time, Mr. Dawson." Hank nodded, bemused by how quickly his solitary life had been rearranged by these women. Yet he couldn't find it in himself to object. There was something about Lily's quiet strength and the innocent helplessness of her daughter that awakened protective instincts he'd thought long buried. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Mrs. Hanson took charge of the household, teaching Lily how to care for Emma while respecting Hank's established habits. Lily grew stronger each day, soon able to move around the cabin without assistance. She insisted on helping with cooking and cleaning, despite Mrs. Hanson's and Hank's protests that she should rest. "I've never been good at sitting idle," she explained as she kneaded bread dough one morning, "and work keeps my mind from wandering to unpleasant thoughts." Hank understood that sentiment all too well. He had thrown himself into ranching after Catherine's death for the same reason. Physical exhaustion made sleep possible, and staying busy prevented him from dwelling on what he'd lost. A week after Lily's arrival, Mrs. Hanson announced she needed to return to her own homestead. "I've animals to tend, and you two seem to have things well in hand." she told them over breakfast. "I'll visit every few days to check on you." Her departure left an awkward silence between Hank and Lily. They had grown accustomed to Mrs. Hanson's cheerful presence buffering their interactions. Now they were essentially alone together, an unmarried man and woman living under the same roof, a situation that would scandalize the town if word got out. "Perhaps I should sleep in the barn," Hank suggested that evening as Lily prepared Emma for bed. She looked up, startled. "Absolutely not. This is your home, Mr. Dawson. If anyone should move to the barn, it's me." "I wasn't suggesting you sleep there," he clarified quickly. "Just thinking about appearances." Lily's expression softened. "You're concerned about my reputation after everything else." "And yours," she added after a moment. "I understand, but we're miles from town and you've been nothing but honorable. I trust you, Mr. Dawson." Her trust humbled him. After all she'd endured at her husband's hands, that she could trust any man was remarkable. "Call me Hank," he said suddenly. "If we're going to be living under the same roof, Mr. Dawson seems overly formal." A small smile curved her lips. "Hank then, and you must call me Lily." That night, as Hank again bedded down on his bedroll near the fire, he reflected on how quickly his life had changed. For 5 years he had existed rather than lived, going through the motions without purpose beyond survival. Now, he found himself planning improvements to the cabin, wondering if he could construct a proper cradle for Emma, considering planting a larger garden since there were more mouths to feed. It wasn't just the practical considerations that had changed. Something inside him was shifting, like ice breaking up on a river after a long winter. He found himself looking forward to mornings, to the smell of coffee and the sound of Lily humming as she moved about the kitchen. He watched Emma grow stronger day by day, marveling at how her tiny fingers now gripped his much larger one when he offered it. These thoughts should have terrified him. Instead, they filled a void he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. 2 weeks after Lily's arrival, Hank rode into Douglas for supplies. The town had grown considerably since its founding just a few years earlier, with the Wyoming Central Railroad bringing new settlers and businesses. He tied his horse outside the general store and entered, nodding to the proprietor, Samuel Thompson. "Hank Dawson," Thompson greeted him. "Twice in 1 month. To what do we owe the pleasure?" Hank handed over the list Mrs. Hanson had prepared. "Just stocking up." Thompson raised his eyebrows as he scanned the items. "Baby clothes, diapers, expecting company, are you?" News traveled fast in small towns, and Hank knew it was better to provide a simple explanation than let gossip flourish unchecked. "Taking in a relative," he said briefly. "A cousin and her baby staying for a while." It wasn't entirely a lie. He was providing shelter to Lily and Emma, and the details were no one's business but their own. Thompson nodded, apparently satisfied. "That's mighty decent of you. Been too long alone out there, if you ask me." "Do you good to have family around?" As Thompson gathered the items on the list, the door opened, admitting Sheriff John Miller. The lawman nodded to Hank in greeting. "Dawson, don't often see you in town." "Sheriff," Hank returned the greeting. Miller leaned against the counter, watching as Thompson added items to Hank's growing pile of purchases. "Been meaning to ride out your way. Had some reports of a stranger in the area asking questions about isolated homesteads." Hank felt a chill. What kind of stranger? Well-dressed city man, according to Widow Hanson. She didn't like the look of him, sent him on his way when he came asking about her neighbors. The sheriff's gaze fell on the baby items. "You got company out at your place?" Before Hank could respond, Thompson interjected. "His cousin and her baby staying a while." "Right, Hank." Hank nodded, grateful for the interruption but concerned by the sheriff's news. Could the stranger be Lily's husband? The timing seemed too coincidental. "This cousin," Sheriff Miller said carefully. "She been with you long?" "Couple weeks," Hank replied, keeping his tone casual while his mind raced. "Why do you ask?" Miller shrugged. "Just curious." This stranger seemed mighty interested in finding a young woman traveling alone, thought there might be a connection. Hank forced himself to remain outwardly calm while alarm bells rang in his head. "My cousin arrived with her husband," he lied smoothly. "He had to return east on business, left her in my care until he returns." The sheriff studied him for a moment, then nodded. Well, if you see anyone suspicious around your property, you let me know. This fellow didn't strike me as the harmless type when I spoke to him." "You met him?" Hank asked, unable to hide his interest. "Briefly, he came to the office asking if I'd had reports of a runaway wife." Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. "Said she was mentally unstable, might harm herself or the child she was carrying. I told him I hadn't heard of any such woman in my jurisdiction." The description confirmed Hank's fears. James Ross was looking for his wife and child. "I'll keep an eye out," Hank promised, paying for his purchases and gathering them into his saddlebags. "Thanks for the warning." As he rode home, Hank's mind worked furiously. If James Ross was in the area, Lily and Emma weren't safe. The man might have believed the sheriff's assurances for now, but eventually he might expand his search to include the outlying homesteads. When he arrived back at the ranch, Lily was hanging laundry on the line, Emma sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle nearby. The domestic scene struck Hank forcefully. How natural it seemed to have them here, how right. The thought of James Ross destroying this newfound peace filled him with cold anger. "Everything all right?" Lily asked as he dismounted, clearly reading the tension in his posture. Hank hesitated. He didn't want to frighten her, but she deserved to know the potential danger. "Let's talk inside," he said, carrying his purchases to the porch. Once inside, he relayed the sheriff's information as gently as possible. Lily's face paled, her hands trembling as she sank into a chair. "He's found me," she whispered, fear evident in every line of her body. "Not yet," Hank assured her, kneeling beside her chair. "But he's looking and he's close. We need to decide what to do." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "I have nowhere else to go, no money to travel further." Her gaze drifted to Emma, still sleeping outside. "I can't let him find us. You don't know what he's capable of." "Then we'll have to make sure he doesn't," Hank said firmly. "This is my land, my home. He has no right to come here making demands." "He's my husband," Lily reminded him, her voice breaking on the word. "In the eyes of the law, he has every right to me and to Emma." The injustice of it burned in Hank's chest. That a man could mistreat his wife and still claim authority over her seemed fundamentally wrong. Yet he knew she was right. The law offered little protection to wives fleeing abusive husbands. "What if he wasn't your husband anymore?" Hank suggested, an idea forming. Lily looked confused. "What do you mean? Divorce is nearly impossible, especially for a woman with no money for lawyers." "I wasn't thinking of divorce." The words came before he fully considered them. "What if you were a widow instead of a wife?" Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by shock. "You're suggesting we pretend James is dead? That would be a lie, and eventually he would prove otherwise." "Not if he was legally declared dead," Hank persisted, the plan developing as he spoke. "People disappear in the West all the time. Accidents, Indian attacks, outlaws. Many men set out on journeys and never return." Lily stared at him, conflicted hope in her expression. "Even if that were possible, it would take years for a legal declaration of death. James would find us long before then." Hank took her hands in his, surprised by his own boldness. "Not if we establish that you're already a widow. We tell everyone your husband died back east, that's why you came to stay with your cousin me. But James will tell anyone who asks that he's very much alive. Only if they connect you to him," Hank pointed out. "If Lily Ross becomes someone else, how would he prove otherwise? Especially if this other woman has documentation of her widowhood." It was a dangerous suggestion, skating the edge of the law, but Hank found he didn't care. Protecting Lily and Emma had become more important than abstract legalities. "You would do that?" Lily asked, searching his face. "Risk harboring a woman who, in the eyes of the law, belongs to another man. You could be arrested." "Let me worry about that," Hank said firmly. "The question is, would you be willing to become someone else, to leave Lily Ross behind entirely?" She was silent for a long moment, considering. "I left her behind the moment I walked out of James's house," she said finally. "I just haven't figured out who I am now." "Then we'll figure it out together," Hank promised. "But first, we need to make sure you're safe." That evening, they developed their plan. Lily would become Laura Dawson, Hank's widowed cousin from Pennsylvania. Her husband, Hank's fictional cousin by marriage, had died of influenza shortly before Emma's birth, prompting Laura to seek the support of her only remaining family in Wyoming. They would need documentation, a marriage certificate, a death certificate, perhaps even a birth record for Emma showing her father's name. These aren't easy documents to obtain, Hank admitted, but I might know someone who can help. In his younger days, before settling on his ranch, Hank had ridden with a man named Jeremiah Wells who had a talent for creating convincing documents. The last he'd heard, Wells had gone straight, opening a print shop in Laramie. "It's a risk," Hank told Lily. "If he refuses or reports us, we could be in trouble." "It's a risk either way," she replied, her determination growing. "If James finds me, I have no doubt he'll kill me for the embarrassment I've caused him, and who knows what he would do to Emma." She took a deep breath. "I choose the risk that gives us a chance." The following day, Hank rode to the widow Hanson's homestead to ask for her help. She listened to their predicament without interruption, then nodded grimly. "I suspected as much when that man came asking questions," she said. "There was something in his eyes I didn't like, cold, like a snake. I told him I didn't know of any woman matching his description, but I doubt he believed me entirely." "Will you help us?" Hank asked. "Lily needs someone to stay with her while I'm gone, and I trust you." "Of course I'll help," Martha Hanson declared without hesitation. "No woman deserves to live in fear, especially not one with a child to protect. I'll come stay at your place until you return from Laramie." Hank's relief was palpable. "Thank you, I won't forget this." "See that you don't," she replied with a wink. "Now, about these documents you're seeking. My late husband's brother works for the county clerk in Cheyenne. He might be able to help legitimately with at least some of what you need." Hope surged in Hank's chest. That would be invaluable. "I'll write him a letter tonight," Martha promised. "You can take it with you tomorrow." The pieces were falling into place faster than Hank had dared hope. That evening, he prepared for his journey to Laramie and Cheyenne, packing supplies and checking his weapons. The trip would take at least a week, possibly longer depending on how difficult it proved to obtain the documents they needed. Lily watched him from the doorway, Emma sleeping against her shoulder. "I don't know how to thank you for all this," she said softly. Hank paused in his preparations. "You don't need to thank me. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't help. Still," she persisted, "you're risking so much for people you barely know." He met her eyes, allowing himself to acknowledge what he had been feeling these past weeks. "I know enough," he said simply. The morning of his departure dawned clear and cool. Martha Hanson arrived before sunrise, her carpetbag in hand, ready to stay with Lily and Emma during Hank's absence. As he saddled his horse, Lily approached with a small package. "For the journey," she explained, pressing it into his hands. It was a cloth-wrapped bundle of biscuits and dried meat. "It's not much, but it's more than enough," he assured her, touched by the gesture. She hesitated, then stood on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. "Be careful," she whispered. The warmth of her lips lingered on his skin as he rode away, a reminder of what he was fighting to protect. The journey to Laramie was uneventful, the familiar Wyoming landscape rolling past as Hank followed the stage road. He reached the growing town by nightfall of the second day and took a room at the Western Hotel. In the morning, he would seek out Jeremiah Wells and hope the man remembered their past friendship fondly enough to help. Wells's print shop was easy to find, situated on the main street among other respectable businesses. A bell jangled as Hank entered, and a tall, thin man looked up from a printing press. "Be right with you," he called, finishing whatever adjustment he was making to the machine. When he straightened and got a good look at his visitor, Wells's expression changed from professional courtesy to shocked recognition. "Hank Dawson," he said, wiping ink-stained hands on his apron. "Never thought I'd see you again." "Hello, Jeremiah," Hank greeted his old riding partner. "You're looking prosperous," Wells grinned. "Turns out there's more money in legal printing than the other kind, and fewer chances of ending up swinging from a tree." His eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm assuming this isn't a social call after all these years." "No," Hank admitted. "I need your help with something delicate." Wells glanced toward the front window, then gestured for Hank to follow him into a back room. Once they were seated with cups of coffee, Hank explained the situation. omitting names and specific locations but conveying the gravity of Lily's predicament. "So you need documentation for a new identity," Wells summarized when Hank finished. "Marriage certificate, death certificate, possibly more. Can you do it?" Hank asked directly. Wells was silent for a long moment, studying his old friend. "You know I've gone straight, Hank. Built a legitimate business, earned people's respect." "I wouldn't ask if there was another way," Hank said quietly. "Her husband will kill her if he finds her, I'm certain of it." Wells sighed heavily. "I didn't say I wouldn't help, just making sure you understand what you're asking." He leaned forward. "This isn't just about forging some documents. You're creating a whole new history for this woman. If it falls apart, the consequences could be severe for all of you." "I understand the risks," Hank assured him. "Do you?" Wells asked pointedly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you might have more than a neighborly interest in this woman and her child." Heat rose in Hank's face. He hadn't admitted to himself the depth of his feelings for Lily, but evidently they were obvious enough for an old friend to perceive. "My interest is in keeping them safe," he said firmly. Wells nodded, apparently satisfied. "All right. I'll need details, names, dates, locations. Make them as true to the original as possible while being different enough that her husband won't make the connection." Hank provided the information they had decided upon. Laura Mitchell had married Thomas Dawson in Philadelphia in 1876. Thomas had died of influenza in February 1878, leaving his pregnant wife to seek refuge with his cousin, Henry Dawson, in Wyoming Territory. Emma Dawson had been born in April 1878 on the journey west. "I can have these ready by tomorrow afternoon," Wells promised. "They won't stand up to intense scrutiny from officials in Philadelphia, but they should be convincing enough for Wyoming Territory." "That's all we need," Hank said, relieved. "And there's one more thing. I have a letter for someone in Cheyenne who might be able to help with legitimate documentation." Wells raised an eyebrow. "You're covering all bases, I see. Good thinking." He pocketed the letter. "I'll make sure this gets to Cheyenne with the next mail coach. Where can I find you when the documents are ready?" "I'm staying at the Western Hotel." Wells nodded. "I'll bring them to you there, less conspicuous than you coming back here." As Hank rose to leave, Wells stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Hank, be careful what you're doing. It's admirable but dangerous. This woman's husband sounds like the type who doesn't give up easily." "Neither do I," Hank replied with quiet determination. True to his word, Wells delivered the documents to Hank's hotel room the following afternoon. They were impressively authentic looking, from the official seals to the aged appearance of the paper. "These should serve your purposes," Wells said, watching as Hank examined them carefully. "I've also included a letter from the church where they were supposedly married, confirming Thomas Dawson's death and expressing condolences to his widow." "This is excellent work," Hank said, genuinely impressed. "What do I owe you?" Wells waved away the question. "Consider it repayment for that time you took a bullet meant for me outside of dead wood." His expression grew serious. "But Hank, I meant what I said about being careful. If this woman's husband is as determined and dangerous as you say, documents alone won't stop him." "I know," Hank acknowledged grimly. "We'll be prepared for that possibility." "Good." Wells handed over a sealed envelope. "This came back from your contact in Cheyenne, delivered by special messenger this morning. Whatever strings you're pulling, they appear to be working." The envelope contained a response from Martha Hanson's brother-in-law, along with several official-looking papers. The note explained that he had been able to create legitimate records for Laura and Emma Dawson in the Cheyenne office, backdating them appropriately. With both the official records and Wells's created documents, Lily's new identity was as secure as they could make it. Hank departed Laramie the next morning, eager to return home. The documents were securely hidden in a false bottom of his saddlebag, a precaution against robbery or unwanted questions. As he rode, his thoughts constantly returned to Lily and Emma, wondering how they were faring in his absence. He pushed his horse harder than usual, stopping only when necessary, and managed to cut a day off his expected return journey. When he finally crested the hill overlooking his ranch, the sight of smoke rising from his chimney filled him with an unfamiliar warmth. For the first time in years, someone was waiting for him to come home. As he rode into the yard, the front door opened, and Lily stepped onto the porch, Emma in her arms. The smile that illuminated her face at the sight of him made Hank's heart beat faster. "You're back early," she called as he dismounted. "Couldn't stay away," he replied honestly, securing his horse to the hitching post. Martha Hanson appeared in the doorway behind Lily. "About time you returned," she said, though her tone was warm. "Any luck with your errand?" Hank patted his saddlebag. "Complete success." "Where can we talk?" They gathered around the kitchen table once Hank had unsaddled his horse and washed the trail dust from his face and hands. Martha prepared coffee while Lily settled Emma in her cradle. When they were all seated, Hank removed the documents from their hiding place and spread them on the table. "It's done," he said simply. "As far as anyone can tell, Laura Dawson is a legitimate widow with all proper documentation." Lily's hand trembled as she reached for the marriage certificate bearing the names Laura Mitchell and Thomas Dawson. "It looks so real," she whispered. "It needs to," Hank replied. "And now we need to practice your new story until it feels as natural as your real one." "You need to become Laura Dawson in every way," Martha nodded approvingly. "I've been working with her on that while you were gone. We've created a whole history where she grew up, how she met Thomas, little details about their life together." "We need to be consistent," Hank agreed. "And we need to introduce Laura to the community gradually, establish her presence before any questions arise." "The church social is next Sunday," Martha suggested. "It would be a good opportunity for people to meet Laura and Emma." Laura looked uncertain. "So soon." "What if I make mistakes?" "You won't," Hank assured her. "And if questions get too detailed, you can always become emotional about your recent loss. No one will press a grieving widow too hard." Laura nodded, determination replacing her uncertainty. "I can do this. I must, for Emma's sake." Over the next few days, they practiced Laura's new identity constantly. Hank and Martha would ask random questions about Laura's past, expecting immediate and consistent answers. By the end of the week, Laura could recite details of her fictional life without hesitation, from the name of the street where she had grown up in Philadelphia to the date of her husband Thomas's death. The morning of the church social dawned bright and clear. Laura dressed in her best clothes, a dark blue dress that Martha had altered to fit her properly. With her hair arranged neatly and Emma dressed in a new gown Hank had purchased in Laramie, she looked every inch the respectable widow. "Remember," Hank said as he helped her into the wagon, "you're in mourning but beginning to look forward again for Emma's sake. Keep your responses simple and let me handle any difficult questions." Laura nodded, cradling Emma close. "I'm ready." The Methodist Church in Douglas was the social center of the community, serving not just as a place of worship, but as the gathering place for all significant events. The monthly social brought together families from miles around, an opportunity to break the isolation of frontier life. As Hank drove the wagon into town, he could see Laura's nervousness growing. "It will be all right," he assured her. "These are good people mostly, they'll welcome you." Her smile was shaky but genuine. "It's not just the deception I'm worried about. It's been so long since I've been in proper society. James, he didn't like me socializing." The casual revelation of another way her husband had controlled her made Hank's jaw clench, but he kept his voice gentle. "Well, I like seeing you happy. And these gatherings can be enjoyable once you get past the initial introductions." The churchyard was already filled with wagons and buggies when they arrived. Hank helped Laura down, then gathered Emma from her arms. "Let me carry her. You'll be bombarded with enough questions without having to manage the baby too." Laura looked grateful for the assistance. Martha Hanson joined them at the church steps, providing additional support for Laura's first public appearance. As expected, their arrival created a stir. Hank Dawson, the reclusive rancher who rarely attended social functions, appearing with a young woman and infant caused heads to turn and whispers to spread. Sheriff Miller was among the first to approach them. "Dawson," he greeted, his eyes moving curiously between Hank and Laura. "This must be the cousin you mentioned." "Yes," Hank replied smoothly. "Sheriff Miller, allow me to introduce my cousin by marriage, Mrs. Laura Dawson, and her daughter, Emma. Laura, this is Sheriff John Miller." Laura offered her gloved hand politely. "Pleased to meet you, Sheriff. Hank has mentioned how well you maintain order in Douglas." The sheriff seemed momentarily taken aback by her refined manner but recovered quickly. "Welcome to our town, Mrs. Dawson. I'm sorry for your loss. Hank mentioned your husband passed recently." "Yes, in February," Laura replied, her voice appropriately subdued. "Thomas contracted influenza. It took him very quickly." Her performance was flawless, Hank noted with relief. Just the right amount of sadness without being overwrought, her Philadelphia accent adding credibility to her Eastern origins. "A tragedy," the sheriff acknowledged, "especially with a child on the way." "Yes," Laura agreed. "I'm fortunate to have family willing to take us in during this difficult time." More introductions followed as they made their way into the church hall, where tables had been set up with food and refreshments. Laura handled each one with grace, maintaining her story consistently while deflecting overly personal questions with gentle reminders of her recent bereavement. Hank stayed close, Emma contentedly sleeping in his arms, a picture of family solidarity that seemed to satisfy most of the curious onlookers. By the time they sat down to eat, the initial wave of interest had subsided and conversation turned to more general topics. "You're doing wonderfully," Hank murmured as they shared a plate of Mrs. Thompson's famous apple pie. Laura's smile was more relaxed now. "It's actually not as difficult as I feared. In some ways, it's liberating to be someone new, someone without those memories." He understood what she meant. Laura Dawson had never been beaten by her husband, never feared for her life or her child's. She carried grief, yes, but it was a clean grief, untainted by violence and betrayal. As the afternoon progressed, Hank noticed Laura genuinely enjoying herself, laughing at the Reverend's gentle jokes and discussing Eastern fashions with the storekeeper's wife. Emma was passed from one admiring woman to another, cooed over and pronounced the most beautiful baby they'd seen in ages. "Your cousin is lovely," Samuel Thompson commented to Hank as they watched Laura charming the banker's formidable wife. "Good to see you bringing her into society. A young widow needs community, especially with a child to raise." Hank nodded, unable to take his eyes off Laura. In that moment, something shifted inside him, a recognition that what had begun as an act of kindness had become something far more profound. He wanted to be more than Laura's protector or Emma's guardian. He wanted to be their family in every sense of the word. The realization should have frightened him, given his 5-year vow against attachment. Instead, it felt right, as if he had finally awakened from a long, dark sleep. They left the social late in the afternoon, Laura tired but visibly pleased with how the day had gone. "I think they accepted me," she said as Hank drove the wagon home. "No one seemed suspicious. You were perfect," he assured her. Everyone was charmed. She blushed at the compliment, adjusting Emma's blanket against the cooling evening air. "It felt good to be around people again, to talk and laugh. I'd forgotten how much I missed that." Hank glanced at her, noting how the setting sun gilded her profile. "We can attend more often if you like. There's the Harvest Festival next month and various gatherings before then." "I'd like that," she said softly, "if it's not too much trouble for you." "No trouble at all," he replied, meaning it. The thought of accompanying Laura to more social events filled him with unexpected pleasure. That night, after Emma had been fed and settled in her cradle, Laura joined Hank on the porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast Wyoming sky like diamonds on velvet. "Thank you," she said after they had sat in companionable silence for a while, "for everything you've done for us. For making me feel safe for the first time in years." Hank turned to look at her, her face softly illuminated by the light spilling from the cabin window. "You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do," she insisted. "You've given us a new life, a chance at happiness I never thought I'd have again." She hesitated, then added quietly, "You've given me hope." The word resonated within him. Hope. He had abandoned it long ago, convinced that happiness was not meant for him after Catherine's death. Yet here it was again, fragile but undeniable, growing stronger each day in Laura's presence. "You've given me something too," he admitted. "A reason to look forward, not just backward." Their eyes met in the darkness, an understanding passing between them that needed no words. They were both healing, both finding their way back to life after different but equally devastating losses. In that moment, Hank wanted nothing more than to pull her into his arms, to show her with actions what he was beginning to feel. But it was too soon, the wounds too fresh on both sides. Instead, he simply reached out and took her hand, a gentle promise of possibilities to come. The weeks passed in a rhythm of work and domestic peace. Laura grew stronger, fully recovering from childbirth and taking on more responsibilities around the ranch. Emma thrived, gaining weight and beginning to show the first hints of her personality, determined like her mother, with a surprisingly hearty laugh for such a tiny being. Hank found himself looking forward to evenings by the fire, Laura sewing or reading aloud from one of his few books while Emma slept nearby. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing stories of their lives before Hank's childhood on an Ohio farm, his journey west after the war, his brief happiness with Catherine. Laura spoke of her own childhood in a small Pennsylvania town, her dreams of adventure that had led her to accept James Ross's courtship despite her parents' reservations. "They saw something in him that I was too young to recognize," she admitted one evening, "a coldness beneath the charm. But I was 18 and thought I knew everything." "You can't blame yourself," Hank said firmly. "Men like Ross are skilled at hiding their true nature until they have control," Laura sighed, setting aside her sewing. "I know that now. But I wasted so many years afraid, believing I deserved what was happening." She looked up, her gray eyes troubled. "Sometimes I still hear his voice in my head, telling me I'm worthless, that no one else would want me." Anger flared in Hank's chest at the thought of anyone making Laura feel that way. "He was wrong," he said, more forcefully than he intended. "So wrong that it's almost laughable if it weren't so cruel." She gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you for that. It helps to hear it, even though I'm learning to believe it on my own." These quiet conversations deepened their connection, building a foundation of trust and understanding that went beyond their shared secret. Laura began accompanying Hank into town occasionally, establishing her presence in the community. She made friends among the church ladies, particularly the younger wives who were charmed by her Eastern manners and education. Emma became a favorite wherever they went, her sunny disposition winning over even the sternest of the old-timers. Hank found himself inordinately proud when people commented on the baby's beauty or alertness, as if she were truly his own. "You're becoming quite the family man," Martha Hanson observed one Sunday after church, watching as Hank expertly balanced Emma on his hip while helping Laura into the wagon. "Just doing what's needed," he replied, though they both knew it was far more than that. Martha patted his arm knowingly. "It suits you, Hank, better than all those years of solitude." He couldn't disagree. The emptiness that had defined his existence for 5 years had been filled with purpose and increasingly with joy. Summer faded into autumn, bringing golden days and cool nights. Hank worked from dawn to dusk, preparing the ranch for winter, repairing fences, storing hay, ensuring the root cellar was stocked with preserved vegetables and fruits. Laura worked alongside him when she could, learning the rhythms of ranch life with enthusiasm. One crisp October morning, Hank rode into town for supplies and mail. Samuel Thompson handed over the usual stack of circulars and catalogs along with a single letter. "Came yesterday," Thompson said. "From back east, looks like." Hank thanked him and tucked the letter into his pocket without examining it closely. It was probably a response to an order he'd placed for winter supplies, or perhaps news from one of his few remaining relatives in Ohio. It wasn't until he was halfway home that curiosity prompted him to pull out the letter. The return address made his blood run cold. J. Ross-esque, Cheyenne, Wyoming territory, not from back east at all, from Cheyenne, less than 100 miles away. Hank reined in his horse, his hands suddenly unsteady as he broke the seal and unfolded the paper within. The message was brief and chilling. "Mr. Dawson, it has come to my attention that you are harboring my wife, Lily Ross, and my child. While I appreciate your Christian charity in providing shelter to a confused young woman, I must insist on the immediate return of my family. Lily has been unwell since the birth of our child, prone to delusions and erratic behavior. Her flight was a symptom of this temporary madness, not a reflection of any mistreatment on my part, as she may have claimed. I will arrive in Douglas on the 15th of October to collect my wife and child. I trust you will have them prepared for the journey home. Should you refuse, I will be forced to involve legal authorities, which would surely cause unnecessary distress to all involved. Respectfully, James Ross, Esq." Hank read the letter twice, rage building with each word. The calculated manipulation, the subtle threat, the complete dismissal of Laura's agency, all hallmarks of the man she had described, and he was coming to Douglas in 3 days. Hank urged his horse into a gallop, the need to warn Laura overriding all other considerations. When he thundered into the yard, she rushed onto the porch, alarm clear on her face. "What's happened?" she asked as he dismounted. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, taking her arm and guiding her inside before handing her the letter. He watched her face as she read, saw the color drain from her cheeks, the trembling of her hands. "He's found us," she whispered, sinking into a chair. "How we were so careful." "The sheriff mentioned a stranger asking questions weeks ago," Hank reminded her. "He must have kept searching, checking homesteads farther out from town." He took the letter from her limp fingers. "But how did he connect you to me specifically?" Laura closed her eyes, thinking. "The church social," she said suddenly. "If he described me to people in town, someone might have mentioned seeing you with a young woman and baby." It made sense. Despite their precautions with documentation, they couldn't prevent people from talking. Douglas was small enough that a newcomer like Laura would be notable, especially one connected to the reclusive Hank Dawson. "What do we do?" Laura asked, her voice steadier now despite the fear in her eyes. "He's a lawyer. He'll have the law on his side." Hank knelt before her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Do you want to run? We could leave tonight, head west to Idaho or Montana, start fresh somewhere he couldn't find us." She considered it briefly, then shook her head. "No, I'm tired of running, of being afraid. And we've built something here, a life, a community. I don't want to give that up." Her courage amazed him. "Then we fight," he said simply. "How? As you said, the law is with him. A husband has rights to his wife and child, regardless of how he treats them." Hank stood, pacing the small confines of the cabin as he thought. "The law recognizes Laura Dawson as a widow with a legitimate claim to her child. As long as no one can prove you're actually Lily Ross, his legal claims have no foundation. But if he sees me, he'll know," she pointed out. "Then perhaps he shouldn't see you," Hank suggested. "At least not until we can ensure you're protected." They spent the remainder of the day and long into the night developing their plan. It was risky, dependent on the goodwill of several people in the community, but it offered their best chance of keeping Laura and Emma safe from James Ross. The following morning, Hank rode to Martha Hanson's homestead to enlist her help. The widow listened to their predicament with growing outrage. "The nerve of that man," she fumed when Hank showed her the letter. "To speak of his wife as if she were a wayward child or a piece of property." "Unfortunately, in the eyes of the law, she's not far from that," Hank replied grimly, "which is why we need your help." Martha's role in their plan was crucial. She would take Laura and Emma to her homestead, keeping them hidden while Hank dealt with James Ross. If things went poorly, she was prepared to help them escape to Laramie, where Jeremiah Wells had connections who could assist them in traveling farther west. "Of course I'll help," she declared without hesitation. "That poor girl and her baby deserve peace, not to be dragged back to a monster." Hank's next stop was the sheriff's office in Douglas. John Miller was a fair man, but he was bound by the law he served. Hank needed to approach him carefully. "Sheriff," he greeted the lawman, who was drinking coffee at his desk. "Got a minute?" Miller gestured to the chair across from him. "What can I do for you, Dawson?" Hank took a seat, considering his words before speaking. That stranger you mentioned a while back, the one looking for his wife. I think he might be coming to my place. The sheriff's eyebrows rose. And why would he do that? I received this yesterday, Hank said, producing the letter. Seems he believes my cousin is actually his wife. Miller read the letter, his expression thoughtful. Interesting, and is she? No, Hank replied firmly. Laura is my cousin by marriage, a widow from Philadelphia. I have all the documentation to prove it. I see. The sheriff handed back the letter. And you're coming to me because I expect trouble when this Ross fellow shows up and finds his wife isn't at my ranch. I wanted you to know the situation in advance. Miller leaned back in his chair, studying Hank's face. Seems to me there's more to this story than you're telling, Dawson. Hank met his gaze steadily. There always is, Sheriff, but what matters is that a young woman and her baby are being threatened by a man who claims authority over them. Whether that's my cousin Laura or some other woman doesn't change the fact that I intend to protect them. A long moment passed before Miller nodded slightly. Fair enough, I appreciate the warning. If this Ross causes trouble in my town, I'll handle it according to the law. It wasn't a promise of support, but it wasn't opposition either. Hank would take what he could get. On October 14th, the day before James Ross's expected arrival, Laura and Emma moved temporarily to Martha Hanson's homestead. The parting, even for what they hoped would be just a few days, was more difficult than Hank had anticipated. Be careful, Laura urged as she prepared to leave with Martha. James is dangerous, especially when he doesn't get his way. I can handle myself, Hank assured her, though the worry in her eyes made him add, I'll be cautious, I promise. She nodded, clutching Emma close. If anything happens, if it goes wrong— It won't, he interrupted. But if it does, Martha knows what to do. She'll get you safely away. Laura handed Emma to Martha, then suddenly stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Hank's neck, pressing her lips to his in a desperate, heartfelt kiss. He responded immediately, pulling her close, pouring into the kiss all the feelings he had carefully contained these past months. When they finally parted, both breathless, Laura touched his cheek gently. That's in case I don't get another chance to do it, she whispered. You will, Hank promised, his voice rough with emotion. This isn't goodbye, Laura, it's just until I deal with Ross, she smiled tremulously. I know, and when this is over we have a lot to talk about, you and I. Yes, he agreed, reluctantly releasing her. We certainly do. He watched them drive away, Martha's wagon disappearing over the hill, and felt a cold resolve settle over him. He would not let James Ross destroy what they had built, no matter what it took. The morning of October 15th dawned gray and cold, matching Hank's mood as he waited for his unwelcome visitor. He had cleaned the cabin thoroughly, removing all traces of Laura and Emma's presence. To all appearances, he lived alone, as he had for years. Shortly after noon, a hired buggy appeared on the road leading to the ranch. Hank watched from the porch as it approached, noting the well-dressed man holding the reins. Even at a distance, there was something cold about him, a rigidity in his posture that spoke of someone accustomed to control. Hank stepped down from the porch as the buggy pulled into the yard, his expression neutral despite the instant dislike. He felt for the man climbing down. James Ross was exactly as Laura had described him, handsome in a polished way, with perfectly tailored clothes and manicured hands that had never done a day's hard labor. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he approached Hank. Mr. Dawson, I presume. He inquired, his tone pleasant but with an underlying coldness. James Ross, I believe you received my letter. I did, Hank acknowledged, making no move to shake the offered hand. But I'm afraid you've made a wasted trip, Mr. Ross. There's no one here but me. Ross's smile faltered slightly. Come now, Mr. Dawson, we both know that's not true. My wife and child are here, and I've come to take them home where they belong. As I said, there's no one here but me, Hank repeated firmly. I live alone. Anger flickered across Ross's face before he smoothed it away. Perhaps we should discuss this inside. It's rather chilly out here. Hank hesitated, then nodded curtly. He didn't particularly want this man in his home, but refusing would only escalate the situation. Fine. Once inside, Ross made a show of looking around the cabin, noting the single plate on the table, the absence of any feminine touches. "Quaint," he commented, removing his gloves, "but hardly suitable for a woman and infant." "I wouldn't know," Hank replied, remaining by the door, his stance relaxed but alert. "As I said, I live alone." Ross's pretense of civility was wearing thin. "Mr. Dawson, I know my wife is here. Several people in town confirmed seeing you with a young woman and baby at church functions." "A woman matching Lily's description exactly." "You're mistaken," Hank said evenly. "The woman you heard about is my cousin, Laura Dawson, a widow from Philadelphia staying with friends in town currently." "Your cousin," Ross's tone made it clear he didn't believe a word. "How convenient." "And I suppose she just happens to look remarkably like my wife," Hank shrugged. "I wouldn't know, I've never met your wife," Ross's patience snapped. "Stop playing games, where is Lily?" "Where is my son, daughter," Hank corrected automatically, then inwardly cursed his mistake. A triumphant gleam appeared in Ross's eyes. "So you do know them. Where are they, Dawson? I won't ask again." Hank abandoned the pretense. "Somewhere safe from you, and that's where they'll stay." "You have no right," Ross snarled, his refined facade crumbling to reveal the anger beneath. "She is my wife, the child is mine, the law is on my side, and if you don't produce them immediately, I'll have you arrested for kidnapping." "On what evidence?" Hank challenged. "You have no proof that Laura Dawson is your wife." "Her documentation is in order: marriage certificate, death certificate for her husband, birth record for her daughter. If you want to challenge those in court, feel free. But until then, she remains a free woman, entitled to live where and how she chooses." Ross stared at him, calculation replacing anger. "You've gone to considerable trouble for a woman who isn't your kin," he observed. "One might wonder why." "One might," Hank agreed, "but it doesn't change the facts. Facts can be altered," Ross said silkily. "Documents can be proven false. And when that happens, you'll face serious charges. Is she worth that risk, Dawson? Is she worth losing your freedom, your ranch, everything you've built?" The threat hung in the air between them. Hank knew Ross wasn't bluffing. He was a lawyer, with connections and resources to pursue this matter legally. But Hank also knew what Laura had endured at this man's hands, what she and Emma would face if forced to return to him. "Yes," he said simply, "she's worth it." Something ugly twisted Ross's features. "You're in love with her," he stated flatly. "You've taken my wife into your bed and now you think you can keep her." The accusation was deliberately provocative. Hank refused to rise to the bait. "What I think doesn't matter. What matters is that Laura and Emma are safe, and they'll remain that way." "We'll see about that," Ross snapped, reaching for his gloves. "I'm going to the sheriff. By nightfall, you'll be in a cell, and Lily will be on her way back to Cheyenne with me." "You're welcome to try," Hank replied calmly. "But Sheriff Miller is already aware of the situation. He knows Laura Dawson as a respected member of our community, not as your runaway wife." Ross paused at the door, his expression cold with fury. "This isn't over, Dawson, not by a long shot." "For your sake it should be," Hank warned. "Walk away, leave them in peace." "Never," Ross spat and stalked out of the cabin. Hank watched from the window as the lawyer climbed into his buggy and whipped the horse into motion, heading back toward town. The confrontation had gone much as he'd expected. Ross was exactly the controlling, dangerous man Laura had described. But now the real challenge began. Ross wouldn't give up easily, and his threats of legal action were not to be dismissed lightly. Hank saddled his horse and took a different route into town, arriving at the sheriff's office before Ross could reach it. Sheriff Miller looked up from his desk, unsurprised. "I take it your visitor has arrived," he asked, and departed, heading this way, Hank confirmed. "He's going to demand you arrest me and force Laura to return with him," Miller sighed, setting aside the paperwork he'd been reviewing. "And what would you have me do, Dawson, if he has a legitimate claim?" "He doesn't," Hank interrupted. "He claims Laura is his wife, Lily Ross. But he can't prove it, not without seeing her. All her documentation identifies her as Laura Dawson, widow." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "You're treading a dangerous line, Hank. If this man is telling the truth, you could be obstructing justice. And if he's lying?" If he's an abusive husband trying to reclaim a woman who fled for her life, Hank challenged. What justice is served by returning her to that? Before Miller could respond, the door burst open and James Ross stormed in, his face flushed with anger. "Sheriff, I demand you arrest this man," he declared, pointing at Hank. "He's kidnapped my wife and child." Sheriff Miller rose calmly. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Ross. Do you have evidence?" "Evidence." "Several people in town confirmed seeing him with a woman and baby matching my wife's description. He admitted knowing where they are but refuses to produce them." "Mr. Dawson," Miller turned to Hank, his expression neutral. "As I told Mr. Ross, the woman in question is my cousin, Laura Dawson, a widow from Philadelphia. Her documentation is in order and she's currently visiting friends in the area." Ross made a sound of disgust. "This is absurd. He's lying, Sheriff. The woman is my wife, Lily Ross." "That's a matter of identification, then," Miller said reasonably. "Perhaps we should have this Laura Dawson come in so you can determine if she's your missing wife." "Absolutely," Ross agreed immediately. "Bring her here." Hank shook his head. "Laura is aware of Mr. Ross's claims and has no desire to meet him. She's not obligated to present herself for his inspection." "Sheriff," Ross appealed, his control slipping, "you can't allow this obstruction." Miller held up a hand. "Mr. Ross, without evidence that this Laura Dawson is actually your wife, there's little I can do legally. Mr. Dawson is correct. She's not obligated to meet with you simply because you claim she's someone else." "This is outrageous," Ross sputtered. "I'll take this to the territorial governor if necessary." "That's your right," Miller acknowledged. "But until you have a court order or conclusive proof, my hands are tied." Ross glared at both men, then straightened his jacket with a sharp tug. "Very well. If that's how you want to play this, so be it. But this isn't over, gentlemen, not by a long shot." He stalked out of the office, slamming the door behind him. Sheriff Miller sighed heavily. "You've made a powerful enemy, Dawson." "Better me than Laura," Hank replied grimly. "Is she worth it?" Miller asked, echoing Ross's earlier question. "This much trouble?" Hank met the sheriff's gaze directly. Yes, something in his tone must have convinced Miller because the lawman nodded slowly. "Then I hope, for all your sakes, that you know what you're doing. Ross won't give up easily." "Neither will I," Hank promised. Over the next few days, James Ross made good on his threats, speaking to anyone in town who might have information about Laura Dawson. He questioned the reverend, the storekeeper, the doctor, anyone who might have had contact with her. Most gave him little useful information, either out of loyalty to Hank or simple disinterest in a stranger's problems. Frustrated by his lack of progress, Ross took a room at the small hotel in Douglas, apparently settling in for a longer stay than he had initially planned. His presence cast a shadow over the town, particularly for Hank, who found himself constantly watching for the lawyer whenever he ventured into Douglas. Meanwhile, Laura and Emmer remained safely hidden at Martha Hanson's homestead. Hank visited when he could, bringing supplies and news. Laura's concern grew with each report of Ross's continued presence in town. "He won't give up," she told Hank during one visit. "He can't bear to lose, especially not something he considers his property." "He'll have to accept defeat eventually," Hank replied, though he shared her concerns. "He can't stay in Douglas forever." "Can't he? He's wealthy, with few responsibilities that can't be handled by his partners in the law firm. He could stay for months if necessary." Hank took her hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "Then we'll wait him out. You're safe here, and eventually he'll have to return to his business in Cheyenne." But they both knew that waiting indefinitely wasn't a practical solution. Laura couldn't remain hidden forever, and Hank couldn't continue riding back and forth without eventually leading Ross to her location. The situation came to a head a week after Ross's arrival. Hank was in town for supplies when he encountered the lawyer outside the general store. Ross blocked his path, his expression coldly triumphant. "I know where she is, Dawson," he said without preamble. "The widow Hanson's place." "Did you think I wouldn't figure it out? Did you think I wouldn't notice your frequent rides in that direction?" Hank kept his face impassive, though inwardly he cursed his carelessness. I have business with Mrs. Hanson. She buys eggs and milk from my ranch. Save your lies, Ross snapped. I'm riding out there tomorrow morning. With or without the sheriff, I will reclaim what's mine. Hank stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. Stay away from there, Ross. This is your only warning. Are you threatening me? Ross's eyes gleamed with anticipation. Please give me a reason to have you arrested before I retrieve my wife. Not a threat, Hank replied evenly. Just advice from someone who knows these parts. The road to Widow Hanson's can be dangerous for those unfamiliar with it. Easy to get lost or have accidents. Ross's smile was cold. I'll take my chances, Dawson. Sunrise tomorrow. You can either bring Lily to me by then, or I'll come for her myself. He brushed past Hank, leaving him standing rigidly in the street, hands clenched at his sides. This was the moment Hank had feared Ross had forced their hand, and now they had to act. He completed his purchases quickly, then rode straight to Martha Hanson's homestead. Laura met him at the door, reading the news in his expression before he said a word. He knows, she guessed, ushering him inside. Hank nodded grimly. He's coming tomorrow at sunrise. We need to move you and Emma tonight. Martha joined them, her practical nature taking over. Where will they go? Not back to your place. That's the first place he'll check after here. Laramie, Hank decided. To Jeremiah Wells. He can hide them while we figure out our next move. Laura shook her head. No more running, Hank. I told you before, I'm tired of it. This is our home now, yours, mine, and Emma's. I won't be chased away by James or anyone else. Laura, he'll force you to return with him, Hank argued. He's a lawyer with the law on his side. Only if he can prove I'm Lily Ross, she countered. And he can't do that without my cooperation. We have all the documentation establishing me as Laura Dawson. What proof does he have to the contrary? His word against yours, Martha pointed out. And in matters between husband and wife, the courts tend to favor the husband. Only if they accept I'm his wife in the first place, Laura insisted. I say we end this charade once and for all. Let me confront him on my terms with witnesses present. Hank stared at her, understanding dawning. You want to face him directly? Laura, that's incredibly risky. No more risky than running forever, she replied steadily. James thrives on control and fear. The one thing he doesn't expect is for me to stand up to him openly. The plan she outlined was audacious and dangerous, but it offered the possibility of a permanent resolution rather than a temporary escape. As Hank listened, he realized that Laura had changed profoundly from the frightened woman he'd found in his barn months ago. She had found her strength, her voice, and now she intended to use them. It might work, Martha said thoughtfully when Laura finished explaining. But everything would have to go perfectly. It's worth the risk, Laura declared, for Emma's future and ours. She looked directly at Hank as she spoke, making it clear what ours meant. They spent the remainder of the day and evening preparing. Messages were sent, arrangements made, every detail carefully considered. By dawn, they would be ready to end James Ross's pursuit once and for all. The sunrise brought clear skies and a biting chill. Hank waited on Martha Hanson's porch, watching the road for the approach of James Ross. Laura remained inside with Emma and Martha, making final preparations for their confrontation. The sound of hoofbeats announced Ross's arrival before his figure appeared on the horizon. He rode alone, as Hank had expected. This was a personal matter for Ross, one he wouldn't want witnesses for. Hank stepped down from the porch as Ross reined in his horse, his rifle casually but visibly in hand. Not a threat, but a clear statement that he was prepared to protect those inside. "Morning, Ross," he greeted calmly. "Right on time." Ross dismounted, his gaze moving from Hank to the closed door of Martha's house. "Where is she?" "Inside," Hank confirmed. "But before you go storming in, you should know we're not alone. Sheriff Miller is here, along with Reverend Taylor and Dr. Wilson." That gave Ross pause. "Why?" "Because Laura requested witnesses for this meeting," Hank explained. "To ensure everything proceeds legally." Suspicion narrowed Ross's eyes. "What game are you playing, Dawson?" "No game, just making sure everything's above board, shall we?" Hank gestured toward the door. Ross hesitated, then gave a curt nod. Hank led the way inside where the others waited. Sheriff Miller, Reverend Taylor, and Dr. Wilson sat at Martha's kitchen table. Martha herself stood by the fire, her expression stern. And in the center of the room, seated in a rocking chair with Emma in her arms, was Laura. She looked up as they entered, her gaze moving past Hank to fix on James Ross. There was no fear in her eyes, only a calm determination that Hank admired tremendously. "James," she greeted him, her voice steady. "It's been some time." Ross stared at her, momentarily thrown by her composed demeanor. "Lily," he finally said, starting forward, "this charade is over. You're coming home with me." Sheriff Miller rose, blocking his path. "Hold on, Mr. Ross. That's not why we're here." "Then why are we here?" Ross demanded, looking around at the assembled witnesses. "To establish the truth," Laura replied, "once and for all." She handed Emma to Martha and stood, facing her husband directly. "You claim I am Lily Ross, your wife." "I maintain that I am Laura Dawson, widow of Thomas Dawson of Philadelphia." "This is absurd," Ross sputtered. "I know my own wife, do you?" Laura challenged. "Then perhaps you can answer some questions about her, about me, that only a husband would know." Ross's confidence faltered slightly. "What kind of questions?" "Simple ones," Laura replied. "For instance, where was Lily Ross born?" "Pittsburgh," Ross answered promptly. "You know that," Laura nodded. "And when did we marry?" "June 12, 1876, in Cheyenne." "Where did we honeymoon?" "We didn't," Ross said impatiently. "I had cases pending. We stayed in Cheyenne." Laura glanced at the witnesses, who were following the exchange with rapt attention. "One more question, James. What is on my right shoulder?" Ross frowned. "Your shoulder?" "Nothing." Laura turned to Dr. Wilson. "Doctor, would you please confirm what is on my right shoulder?" The doctor approached as Laura partially lowered her dress at the shoulder, revealing a distinctive heart-shaped birthmark. "A birthmark," Dr. Wilson confirmed for the others. "Quite noticeable." Ross's face flushed with anger. "This proves nothing. Anyone can have a birthmark. But a husband should know if his wife has one," Laura pointed out. "Just as he should know that Lily was born in Cincinnati, not Pittsburgh, that we married on July 15, not June 12, and that we honeymooned in Denver for 2 weeks. Minor details," Ross dismissed, "easily forgotten over time." "Perhaps," Laura conceded. "But there's one detail you can't have forgotten, James, the reason I left you." Ross's expression darkened. "You left because you were unwell, confused by your pregnancy." "I left," Laura continued as if he hadn't spoken, "because of this." She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a long, jagged scar on her forearm. "You did this when I told you I was with child. You threw me down the stairs, then blamed me for being clumsy." A shocked silence fell over the room. Ross's face contorted with rage. "You lying whore," he snarled, lunging toward her. Hank moved instantly, intercepting Ross before he could reach Laura. "That's enough," he said, restraining the smaller man with relative ease. "You see," Laura said to the witnesses, her voice remarkably calm. "This is why I left. This is what I feared for my child. The real Lily Ross fled an abusive husband, fearing for her life and her babies. I can't speak for her, but I can tell you that Laura Dawson would never return to such a man, regardless of legal obligations." Sheriff Miller approached Ross, who was still struggling in Hank's grip. "Mr. Ross, I think it's clear there's some confusion about this lady's identity, but what's absolutely clear is that you just attempted to assault her in front of multiple witnesses, including an officer of the law." "She provoked me deliberately," Ross protested. "That's no excuse for violence," Reverend Taylor interjected, his expression severe, "especially against a woman." "I suggest you return to Cheyenne, Mr. Ross," the sheriff continued. "And if Lily Ross truly is missing, file the proper reports through official channels. But Laura Dawson is free to remain here under her own identity unless you can provide concrete evidence to the contrary, which, so far, you have failed to do." Ross looked from face to face, finding no sympathy among the witnesses. His composure cracked further as he realized his position was untenable. "This isn't over," he promised, glaring at Laura. "I'll be back with proof, with court orders. You won't get away with this." "I already have," Laura replied softly. "Goodbye, James." Sheriff Miller escorted Ross from the house, ensuring he mounted his horse and rode away from the property. The others remained inside, the tension gradually easing from the room as the immediate threat departed. "Well," Martha said into the silence, "that was quite a performance, Laura." Laura sank back into the rocking chair, the calm facade finally cracking to reveal the exhaustion beneath. It wasn't entirely a performance. Everything I said about the birthmark, the wedding details, the scar, all true for Lily Ross. But delivered by Laura Dawson, Hank said with admiration. "You were magnificent." She managed a tired smile. "Do you think it worked? Will he give up?" "Not immediately," Hank admitted. "But we've made it much harder for him to pursue his claims." The sheriff, reverend, and doctor all witnessed his violent reaction. That alone will make any legal authorities hesitant to support him. And, Dr. Wilson added, they witnessed a woman who clearly is not the unstable, confused person Ross described. "Your composure was remarkable, Mrs. Dawson." Laura accepted Emma back from Martha, holding her daughter close. "I had plenty of motivation," she said, looking down at the baby. "And excellent support." The witnesses departed after extracting promises from Hank and Laura to inform them if Ross returned or caused further problems. When only Martha, Hank, Laura, and Emma remained, Laura finally allowed herself to release the breath she seemed to have been holding. "He'll be back," she said quietly. "Not today, probably not tomorrow, but eventually. James doesn't give up when his pride is wounded." "When he comes, we'll be ready," Hank promised. "Together." The word hung in the air between them, filled with meaning beyond this immediate crisis. Together not just against James Ross, but for all the days to come. "Together," Laura echoed, her eyes meeting his with unmistakable warmth. Martha cleared her throat dramatically. "Well, I think I'll check on my chickens," she announced, making her way outside with exaggerated purpose. When they were alone, Hank knelt beside Laura's chair, taking her free hand in his. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've been thinking about adding on to the cabin. Another bedroom, maybe a proper parlor, the kind of home a family might need." Laura's smile was radiant. "That sounds like an excellent plan, though there's one thing we should probably address first." "What's that?" "Well," she said, her cheeks flushing slightly, "if we're going to be a proper family, perhaps Laura Dawson should consider changing her name one more time." Hank's heart swelled with joy he had thought forever lost to him. "Are you proposing, Mrs. Dawson?" "I believe I am, Mr. Dawson," she replied, her gray eyes twinkling with mischief and love. "What do you say?" In answer, Hank leaned forward and kissed her, pouring 5 years of lonely grief and newfound hope into the gesture. When they finally parted, he pressed his forehead against hers. "I say yes," he whispered. 1,000 times yes. The first snow of winter blanketed Douglas and the surrounding countryside 2 months later, transforming the landscape into a glistening white expanse. Inside Hank's cabin, now significantly expanded with the help of neighbors and friends, a fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting warm light over the simple gathering. Laura stood beside Hank, radiant in a new dress of deep blue, her dark hair arranged with white flowers. Emma, now 7 months old and sitting up by herself, watched from Martha Hanson's arms as Reverend Taylor spoke the words that would make their family official. "Do you, Henry James Dawson, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" "I do," Hank replied, his voice steady and sure. "And do you, Laura Elizabeth Dawson, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Laura's smile was luminous as she answered, "I do." "Then, by the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The small gathering of friends, Martha Hanson, Sheriff Miller, Dr. Wilson, Samuel Thompson, and his wife applauded as Hank kissed his bride. Emma joined in with an enthusiastic babble, reaching her arms toward her parents. The wedding supper that followed was modest but joyful, the table laden with dishes contributed by their guests. As they ate and celebrated, Hank marveled at how completely his life had transformed in the span of half a year. From solitary grief to surrounded by friends and family, from empty silence to a home filled with laughter and love. There had been no further word from James Ross since his confrontation at Martha's homestead. Whether he had given up or was biding his time, they couldn't know for certain, but Laura no longer lived in fear of him. She had established herself firmly in the community as Laura Dawson, and now as Hank's wife, her position was even more secure. As the evening progressed, Hank found a moment alone with his new wife, drawing her into the kitchen while their guests continued celebrating in the main room. "Happy?" he asked, pulling her into his arms. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, reaching up to touch his face tenderly. "When I fell asleep in your barn that night, I had no hope left, just desperation, and now look at us. Who would have thought?" Hank mused, thinking of how close he had come to turning her away, to maintaining his solitude and his vow never to love again. Laura seemed to read his thoughts. "Thank you for letting us stay," she said softly, "for opening your home and your heart when you had every reason to keep them closed." "Best decision I ever made," he assured her, bending to kiss her again. A cry from the other room announced that Emma needed attention. Laura laughed against his lips. "Duty calls, Mr. Dawson." "Indeed it does, Mrs. Dawson," he agreed, releasing her reluctantly. "But we have all the time in the world now." And they did. Time to raise Emma together, to add more children to their family in the years ahead, to build the life neither of them had thought possible after their respective losses. The path forward wouldn't always be smooth life in Wyoming territory, rarely, but they would face whatever came together, drawing strength from each other, and from the love that had blossomed so unexpectedly in a hay-strewn barn on a warm June night. As Hank watched Laura tend to Emma, surrounded by their friends in the home they now shared, he silently thanked whatever twist of fate had led her to his barn that night. The cowboy who had sworn off love had found it again in the most unlikely of circumstances, and this time, he intended to hold on to it forever.